The land did not care. That was the first and last lesson of Montana in the year of our Lord, 1885. It spread itself out under a sky so vast it could make a soul feel like a fly in a bottle, endless and indifferent. In the late autumn, the jagged peaks of the distant ranges were already capped with the threat of winter, their stone faces hard and gray against the pale blue. Below them, the great sweep of the plains rolled on and on, the grasses burned gold and brown by the frost, whispering secrets to a wind that had no ears to listen. The air itself was sharp, a clean, cold scent of pine and damp earth that promised a bitter season to come. It was a beautiful country, but its beauty was that of a well-honed knife, stark and unforgiving, and it bred a profound and terrible loneliness in the people who dared to call it home. This was the world seen through the eyes of Alara Vance. At 28 years old, she moved with the quiet economy of someone who has learned that wasted effort is a sin against survival. Each morning, she broke the thin sheet of ice in the water trough with the butt of her axe, the crack of it loud in the frozen stillness. She fed the half-dozen chickens that were her only company, their clucking a small, welcome noise in the great silence. She split wood, her swings practiced and sure, the blade biting into the seasoned pine with a satisfying thud. But for all her competence, a deep weariness had settled into her bones, a weight in the slump of her shoulders that had nothing to do with the labor of the day. Her homestead was a small island of human order carved out of the sprawling wilderness, a sturdy log cabin chinked tight against the wind, with a thin ribbon of smoke always rising from its stone chimney, a barn that smelled of hay and animal warmth, a few acres of land surrounded by a split rail fence, a stark declaration of ownership against a landscape that defied being owned. Here, within these fences, was her entire world. Her thoughts were a low, constant hum, a melancholic tune played on the strings of memory and the demands of the present. 2 years. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all since the day her world had cracked open and everything she loved had fallen inside. The past did not come to her in long, gentle waves of remembrance. It came in shards, brief and piercing, sharp enough to draw blood. Sometimes, while kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour, she would be struck by the sudden phantom sound of her husband Daniel's laughter, a deep rumbling sound that had always made the little cabin feel warm. Or, when herding the chickens into their coop at dusk, she would feel the ghost of her 5-year-old daughter Lily's small hand tucked inside her own, the memory so real it made her fingers ache. And then, inevitably, would come the other memory, the one she fought against with all her might. It was not a sight, but a smell, the sickening metallic scent of blood that had hung in the winter air, thick and cloying, an odor that had clung to her clothes and hair and throat for weeks. She remembered finding them. The snow had been falling, thick, silent flakes that seemed to be trying to bury the horror, to cover it in a blanket of pure, clean white. The cabin door was ajar. An unnatural stillness had replaced the familiar sounds of her life. Daniel was by the woodpile, Lily a small, still heap near the porch steps she had loved to sit on. The sheriff, when he finally rode out from Redemption, had been dismissive, his eyes impatient. He had looked at the scene for less than an hour, his boots crunching in the blood-stained snow. The investigation, if one could call it that, was cursory. Vagrants, he'd said, or maybe some roving band of natives, a random, terrible act. But nothing had been taken. Not the money in the coffee tin, not the good rifle over the mantel, not the silver locket on Alara's dresser. The lack of motive was a question that gnawed at her soul, a loose thread in the official story that she could not stop pulling. Her isolation was as real and solid as the log walls of her cabin. She went into the town of Redemption only when necessity demanded it, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. For the supplies she could not grow, hunt, or make herself. Each trip was an ordeal. She saw the town not as a place of comfort and community, but as a gauntlet to be run. The main street was a wide, unpaved track of mud in the wet months and choking dust in the dry. The buildings wore false fronts, pretending to be grander than they were, Henderson's General Store, the Redemption Saloon with its swinging doors, and rising above them all, the tall, imposing steeple of the First Redemption Church. The steeple was the town's anchor, its point of pride, its unblinking eye. The people of Redemption treated her with a subtle, layered cruelty that was more painful than any open insult. The women would see her coming and pull their children a little closer, as if she carried a contagion. The men would stop their whittling or their talking and just stare, their expressions a bland mixture of pity and suspicion. Whispers followed her, a physical shadow that clung to her back. The cursed widow, she had heard a child say once, before his mother shushed him with a sharp slap. They spoke of her as if the tragedy had not just happened to her, but was a part of her, a darkness she radiated. The source of this poison, she knew, was the town's spiritual heart, Preacher Theron. He was a tall, severe man with a voice that could roll like thunder from the pulpit. He spoke of divine judgment and the mysterious, terrible ways of God's will. He never mentioned Ilara by name in his sermons, but he did not have to. He spoke of the wages of sin, of darkness finding a purchase in weak souls, and he would let his words hang in the air, heavy with implication. He had, with his righteous piety, painted Ilara as a living parable, a figure touched by a dark and cautionary fate, her private agony transformed into a grim public warning for his flock. On her last trip to town, the autumn air had already held its sharp bite. She had tied her old wagon to the hitching post outside the general store and walked inside, her shopping list clutched tight in her hand. The place smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was a balding man with a perpetually worried expression. He nodded at her, his greeting civil but cool. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Mr. Henderson, I need flour, 20 pounds, and salt, coffee, and a box of cartridges for the Winchester." Their conversation was clipped, transactional. He weighed out the flour, his movements efficient, the silence between them thick with all the things they were not saying. As he was counting out the cartridges, the bell over the door jingled and Mrs. Gable entered. She was a stout woman whose face was set in a permanent state of moral disapproval, and she was Preacher Theron's most devout follower. Her eyes landed on Ilara, and a flicker of something hard and knowing passed through them. She addressed Mr. Henderson, but her words were aimed like arrows at Ilara. "A hard winter coming, they say," Mrs. Gable announced, pulling her shawl tighter. "A time for the righteous to band together, to keep the flock safe and warm and protected from unwelcome elements." Her eyes slid meaningfully toward Ilara before returning to the storekeeper. The weight of her judgment, of all their judgments, felt like a physical burden. Ilara paid Mr. Henderson, her hands fumbling with the coins. She did not look at Mrs. Gable again. She loaded her sacks and boxes onto the wagon as quickly as she could and clicked the reins, urging the old horse into a brisk walk. She did not relax until the false fronts of redemption were gone from her sight, and the vast, silent emptiness of the trail home wrapped around her like a welcome blanket. A week later, the weather turned. It began not with a storm, but with a change in the light. The brilliant, crisp blue of the autumn sky began to leach away, replaced by a flat, uniform gray that seemed to press down on the land. The wind's song changed, its gentle whisper through the pines deepening into a low, mournful howl that rattled the single glass pane in Ilara's cabin window. The squirrels and chipmunks, who had been frantic in their preparations for weeks, disappeared entirely. A nervous, expectant energy settled over the wilderness. Ilara felt it in her bones. A blizzard was coming, a bad one. She prepared with the methodical calm of a soldier readying for battle. She led her horse and the milk cow into the relative warmth of the barn, ensuring their stalls were filled with fresh, clean hay and their water troughs were full. She checked the chinking between the logs of her cabin, pushing mud and moss into any crack that might admit the wind. Then began the arduous task of bringing in the firewood, for the better part of a day. She worked, hauling load after load from the massive, neatly stacked woodpile Daniel had built, until a wall of logs stood against the inside of the cabin, enough to last a week, maybe more. She was a survivor. She had learned to fight the land, the weather, the loneliness, all on her own. As she latched the cabin door for what might be the last time in days, she felt a grim sense of comfort. The storm would enforce her isolation. It would turn her social exile into a physical reality. And in a strange way, that felt more honest. It hit near dusk. The howl of the wind rose to a deafening, terrifying roar. The world outside the window dissolved into a churning, violent maelstrom of white. Snow did not fall. It flew sideways, driven by a wind that seemed alive with malice, a wind that clawed at the roof and screamed down the chimney, trying to tear the little cabin from its foundation. Days lost their meaning. Morning, noon, and night were all the same gray, roaring twilight. Ilara's world shrank to the small, warm circle of light cast by her fireplace and the oil lantern on her small table. She moved through her solitary life with a practiced, numb efficiency. She fed the fire, melted snow for water, mended a tear in her winter coat. She took out the worn, leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her mother and read from it. Not for any comfort she might find in God's word, for she felt God had long since abandoned this place, but for the familiar, rhythmic cadence of the verses, the simple sound of language in the overwhelming noise of the storm. She disassembled her rifle, cleaning each piece with an oiled rag until the firelight gleamed on the dark metal, then put it back together with sure, steady hands. The storm was a cocoon, and she was the only living thing inside. But in the howling silence, the ghosts of her family felt closer. Their absence was no longer a dull ache, but a sharp, acute pain that made it hard to breathe. It was on the fourth day, during a brief, strange lull when the roaring wind subsided to a low moan, that she looked out the small, frost-etched window, and she saw it. A dark shape against the endless, blinding white. It was near the line of cottonwood trees that marked the far edge of her property. A horse. It stood with its head bowed, its back to the wind, a statue of misery. It was riderless. Her first instinct was a jolt of pure caution. A riderless horse meant a rider in trouble, and trouble was the last thing she needed. It could be a hunter who had lost his way, a trapper, or it could be something far worse, an outlaw, a desperate man. But as she watched, the horse shuddered, its whole body trembling with cold and exhaustion. Her deep-seated compassion, a thing she thought had been buried under 2 years of hardened grief, stirred painfully in her chest. Whatever the rider was, the animal was innocent. She could not let it freeze to death. Pulling on her heaviest coat, wrapping a wool scarf around her face, and tugging on thick fur mittens, she unlatched the door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The snow was thigh-deep, a thick, powdery trap that fought her with every step. The 100 yards to the tree line felt like a mile. The cold was a living thing, seeping through her layers of clothing, burning her exposed cheeks. She reached the horse, a magnificent roan, its coat caked with ice. It snorted weakly at her approach but did not move. It was spent. And then she saw the tracks leading away from it. Not the clean tracks of a man walking, but the stumbling, uneven prints of someone staggering, falling. One footprint was deeper than the other, dragged. Her heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of fear and dread. She followed the tracks. She found him half buried in a snowdrift not 50 paces away. A man. He was unconscious, his face ashen and pale against the snow, his lips tinged with blue. A dark, ugly stain was spreading on the white canvas beneath his leg. He was dressed in worn denim and leather chaps, a heavy duster coated in a thick layer of ice. He was a stranger, a complete unknown from a world she had shut out, and every instinct for self-preservation she had honed over the past 2 years screamed at her. Leave him. Go back. Lock the door. This is not your trouble. The whispers from redemption echoed in her mind. Inviting a stranger in is inviting the very darkness she was accused of harboring. She stood over him, the wind tearing at her, the snow swirling around them. Her face was a mask of hardened resolve, but her eyes betrayed the war raging inside her. She looked down at his hand, half buried in the snow, the fingers curled and stiff. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, it looked like Daniel's hand, strong and capable, the hand that had built this cabin, the hand that had held hers. The memory was a fresh stab of pain, but through that pain, a flicker of something else sparked. Humanity. She had lost so much, had been so brutalized by life and by people, but she was not yet a monster. She could not leave another human being to die in the snow. It was a line she would not cross. Getting him back to the cabin was a grueling, desperate battle. He was a dead weight, a heavy man of muscle and bone, and she was not large. She untied the rope from the roan's saddle and managed to loop it under his arms. She used the exhausted horse, her own straining muscles, and a reserve of sheer, desperate will she did not know she possessed. She half dragged, half carried him through the crushing snow, the wind a constant adversary, her breath coming in ragged, frozen clouds. The journey back was an epic struggle, a small, forgotten woman against the full, indifferent fury of a Montana winter. Inside, the sudden warmth and quiet of the cabin were a shock. She barred the door against the storm and leaned against it, gasping for breath, her body screaming with effort. She got her first good look at him then, in the soft light of the lantern. He was ruggedly handsome, in a way that spoke of a hard life lived outdoors. There were lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a faint, white scar ran along his jawline, even unconscious, limp on her floor. He had an aura of coiled strength about him. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this was a dangerous man. With her hunting knife, she cut away his frozen, blood-soaked pant leg. The wound was deep and ugly, a ragged gash along his thigh. It was inflamed, the skin around it an angry red. A fall from his horse, perhaps, or a glancing bullet. Whatever the cause, it was badly infected. He would die if she did nothing. The next hour was a blur of focused, grim work. She stoked the fire until it roared and put a kettle of water on to boil. She tore strips from one of her few clean linen sheets, pouring some of Daniel's precious whiskey into a bowl. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle and sure. He did not stir. She sterilized her largest sewing needle and a length of thread in the flames of the fire until they glowed red-hot. Then, with her jaw set and her hands steady, she began to stitch the torn flesh together. He groaned in his delirium, the sound low and guttural. He muttered names she did not recognize, fragmented phrases about dust and sun and a man named Abel. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly. She managed to heave him onto her own narrow bed, the effort nearly breaking her back. Through the long, howling hours of the night, she tended to him. She forced warm broth made from dried beef between his lips, a spoonful at a time. She kept a cool, wet rag on his feverish forehead. She fed the fire, ensuring the cold did not reclaim the small space she had won from it. As she worked, as she watched him, she allowed herself to study the stranger in her home. She saw the heavy calluses on his hands, the hands of a man who worked with horses and ropes, or maybe a gun. She saw the utter weariness in his sleeping face, a weariness that seemed to run deeper than his injury. She wondered what kind of trouble had been chasing him, to be caught out alone in a blizzard like this. She was intensely, uncomfortably aware of his presence. After 2 years of absolute solitude, the sheer maleness of him was an intrusion, a disruption of the highest order. It was frightening. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt smaller, crowded. The steady silence she was accustomed to was now punctuated by the sound of his breathing, a constant, living reminder that she was no longer entirely alone. This forced intimacy was deeply unsettling, and she felt her emotional walls, the ones she had so carefully built, reinforcing themselves, turning to ice and stone even as her hands worked to save his life. The part ended there, in the heart of the blizzard. The stranger, Silas Cole, lay unconscious in her bed. The storm raged on, a white fury that had isolated them completely from the rest of the world. And Elara Vance stood by the fireplace, her Winchester rifle leaning against the wall nearby, watching the man whose life she had just saved. Her expression, lit by the flickering firelight, was unreadable. She had dragged the unknown in from the cold, and she had no idea if she had just saved a life or destroyed what was left of her own. For 3 more days the blizzard raged, a relentless assault of wind and snow that seemed determined to scour the world clean. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. A profound, pristine silence fell over the landscape, so deep and complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, it was brilliant and cold, setting the endless blanket of white to glittering with a million tiny diamonds. The air was clean, stripped of all scent but the sharp freshness of the cold. It was a world reborn, washed clean of all its sins. It was into this new, clean world that Silas Cole finally awakened. The first thing he knew was pain, a deep, throbbing fire in his left leg that seemed to have its own heartbeat. The second was confusion. The ceiling above him was not the endless Montana sky, but low, rough-hewn logs, dark with age and smoke. The air, instead of being sharp with cold, was warm and smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, something faintly of soap and woman. He turned his head, the movement slow and stiff, and saw her. She was sitting in a chair across the small room, near the fireplace, watching him. A woman with a face too young for the sorrow in her eyes that were wary and guarded, like a doe that has heard the snap of a twig in the woods. Their first conversation was built of short, cautious words, like stones being carefully placed to cross a fast-moving stream. Elara's voice was flat, devoid of the warmth that filled the small cabin. "You're awake," she stated. It was not a question. "Where am I?" His own voice was a gravelly, unused thing. "My homestead. You were caught in the blizzard. I found you in a snowdrift." She explained the facts of his rescue and her care with the detached precision of a general giving a field report. There was no warmth, no welcome. "What is your name?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind still thick with fever dreams. Silas Cole." "What were you doing out in that storm, Silas Cole?" The lie came easily, a well-worn coat he could slip on without thinking. "Pushing a herd north, from the Judith Basin. Got turned around looking for a lost steer. The storm, it came on faster than I figured." It was a simple, plausible story, the kind of trouble any cowboy could find himself in. He watched her face carefully, trying to gauge if the lie had landed on solid ground. Elara's expression was a stoic mask, giving nothing away. She simply nodded, a small, sharp movement of her head. "You can stay until your leg is healed," she said, her tone making it clear that this was a statement of necessity, not an invitation. "Until you are strong enough to travel." The words she did not say were louder than the ones she did, and not a moment longer. Then she added, looking not at him, but at the fire, "You shouldn't have come here." It was not a threat, not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, a profound warning about the nature of her world and the trouble that found its way into it. The weeks that followed were a slow, quiet dance of cohabitation in a space too small for 2 people who were strangers to each other. The cabin was a single room, forcing a proximity that was a constant, low-grade discomfort for them both. Silas was confined to the narrow bed, a state of helplessness that grated on his very soul. He was a man of action, of movement, and being laid up like this felt like being caged. It gave him little to do but watch her. And so he watched. He watched Elara move about the cabin with an efficiency that was a silent marvel. He watched her chop firewood, her swings clean and powerful, a testament to a strength that belied her slender frame. He watched her tend to her small flock of chickens, her movements gentle, her voice a low murmur as she scattered their feed. He watched her haul buckets of snow inside to melt on the hearth for water. a relentless, back-breaking chore she performed without complaint. He saw a resilience in her that was as stark and unyielding as the mountains outside her window, a toughness that stood in sharp contrast to the fragile sorrow in her eyes. He had plenty of time to think. Lying there in the quiet, his own ghosts were his most frequent visitors. The smoky haze of a saloon in Laredo would fill his vision, the smell of cheap whiskey and fear thick in his nostrils. He would see the quick, angry flash of a gun in the lantern light, and the surprised look on the face of a man he had been paid to kill. He had been a gun for hire, one of the best, moving from one dusty, forgotten town to the next. But the life had bled him dry of whatever good had once been in him, leaving him hollowed out, empty, and always looking over his shoulder. The cattle drive north was a fiction. The journey was about escape. He was trying to outrun a reputation that clung to him like a shroud, and the enemies that reputation had earned him. In Ilara's deep guardedness, in the way she kept the world at arm's length, he saw a mirror of his own soul. He recognized the look of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and it forged a strange, unspoken kinship between them in the silence. Ilara, for her part, worked hard to maintain a deliberate, unbreachable distance. She spoke only when it was necessary to ask if he needed water or to tell him his meal was ready. She ate her own meals in silence, seated at the small table across the room, her back mostly to him. Yet, she was meticulously attentive to his physical needs. She changed the bandage on his leg every morning, her touch gentle but impersonal. She prepared simple, nourishing meals of broth and stew. She made sure the fire in the hearth never died down, its warmth a constant shield against the brutal cold outside. It was a practical, detached form of care, a duty performed without an ounce of sentiment. But Silas began to sense something more, cracks in the icy armor she wore. He noticed the small things, the way her hands would sometimes tremble, an almost imperceptible tremor. When she was stirring a pot and thought he was not looking, he saw the profound, bottomless sadness that would fill her eyes when she stared into the flames of the fire, her mind clearly 1,000 miles away in a place of deep pain. And he noticed the way she would sometimes reach up and touch a small object on the mantelpiece, a little bird carved from a piece of light wood, her fingers tracing its shape as if it were a holy relic. A turning point came one evening, nearly a week after he had awakened. The infection in his leg, which had been slowly receding, flared up again, bringing with it a high fever. As night fell, Silas slipped into a delirium, his mind lost in the treacherous landscape of his past. He was in a dusty Texas town, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. The taste of gun smoke was on his tongue. He thrashed in the narrow bed, the blankets tangling around him, and cried out a name, his voice raw with anguish. "Abel!" The shout startled Ilara from her light sleep on a cot she had made for herself near the hearth. In an instant, she was by his side. All the practiced detachment, all the careful walls she had built, crumbled in that moment. Without thinking, she dipped a cloth in the cool water bucket and placed it gently on his burning forehead. She began to speak to him in a soft, soothing voice, a voice full of a tenderness he would not have believed she possessed. It was the voice she had once used to soothe her daughter's nightmares. "Hush now," she murmured, her hand smoothing the hair back from his brow. "You're safe. You're safe here." His thrashing subsided in his fevered sleep. His hand found hers and gripped it, his hold surprisingly strong, anchoring him to the reality of her touch. Ilara froze. Her entire body went rigid. The unexpected physical contact was a jolt to her system, a lightning strike to a frozen pond. For a long, breathless moment, she did not pull away. The feel of his hand, warm and real and alive, clasping hers, was the first human touch she had willingly accepted in 2 long, empty years. It was terrifying. It was comforting. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Finally, with a careful, deliberate slowness, she slipped her hand from his grasp. She retreated to her cot, deeply unsettled, her mind reeling from the crack that had just appeared in her emotional armor. As the days turned into weeks, Silas's fever broke for good, and his leg began to heal in earnest. The dynamic in the small cabin shifted. Ilara fashioned a crude but sturdy crutch for him from a tree branch, and he was finally able to move around the small space. He hated being a burden, and he insisted on helping in any way he could. He could not do the heavy work of chopping wood or hauling water, but he could sit by the fire and mend a broken piece of harness leather. He used her whetstone to put a razor-sharp edge on her axe and knives, and he began to fill the silence with quiet conversation. He started to tell her stories. He was careful, never speaking of his violent past. Instead, he told her of growing up on a small farm in Ohio, of the smell of the earth after a spring rain, of the trouble he and his brother used to get into. He described the vast, empty deserts of Arizona, the towering, tree-covered mountains of Colorado, and the endless, star-filled sky on a clear night in the high plains. His voice was a low, calming rumble in the quiet cabin, a sound that began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a part of the place. To her own surprise, Ilara found herself slowly, reluctantly, responding. She began to share small, safe pieces of her own life. She spoke of her childhood on a farm back east, of her father teaching her to read from the Bible, of the wildflowers that carpeted the nearby meadow in the spring, lupine and Indian paintbrush. She never, ever spoke of Daniel or Lily. That part of her life, the part that had been her whole world, remained a locked and bolted room inside her heart. But the simple act of sharing anything, of speaking of a time before the tragedy, was a monumental step, a thawing of a long and bitter frost. The outside world intruded on their isolated existence on a bright, cold afternoon in the middle of winter. A figure on snowshoes appeared at the edge of the clearing, and Ilara was instantly on guard, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle she kept propped by the door. The man hailed the cabin, and she recognized the voice of Jed, an old, grizzled trapper who passed through the area a couple of times a year. His arrival was a shock to their quiet routine. Jed was a harmless man with a face like a road map of his hard life, but his eyes widened in surprise when he saw Silas sitting by the fire. The presence of another man in the widow's cabin was a piece of news as valuable as a prime beaver pelt. "Well now, Ilara," Jed said, his gaze shifting from her to Silas and back again. "Did not figure you for having company." His questions were friendly, but they were probing, an attempt to get the shape of the story he would later tell in town. Silas handled him with an easygoing charm that deflected any real inquiry. He claimed to be an old friend of Ilara's family, a cousin from back east who had been traveling through and got caught by the big storm. It was a thin story, but Jed had no reason to doubt it openly. He stayed for an hour, sharing a cup of hot coffee and the latest news from the outside world, then took his leave with a fresh supply of salt and a story to tell. When he was gone, a new tension settled over the cabin. Ilara knew, with a certainty that filled her with a cold dread, that by the time Jed made it to redemption, the whole town would know. The cursed widow was not alone. She had a man staying with her. The whispers would become a roar. The tension between Ilara and Silas grew, but now it was charged with a different, more volatile energy. There was an undeniable physical awareness between them, a current that flowed through the small space. They were hyper-conscious of each other's every movement. A moment when their hands brushed as she passed him a plate of stew became electric. A lingering glance across the flickering firelight held a universe of unspoken questions. Silas found himself captivated by her. He was drawn to her quiet strength, to the deep well of sorrow he saw in her, and to a delicate beauty that 2 years of grief and hardship had not managed to extinguish. Ilara, in turn, was terrified by the feelings Silas was awakening in her. He made her feel a warmth she had forgotten existed, a flicker of desire she thought had died with Daniel. He looked at her not as the town did, not as a cursed object of pity and suspicion, but as a woman, and that simple act of being seen felt like a betrayal of her family's memory, a dangerous, terrifying thawing of the ice she had come to believe she needed to survive. One afternoon, Silas, now able to walk with only a slight limp, was standing by the fireplace. He reached up and gently took the small, carved bird from the mantelpiece, holding it in the palm of his calloused hand. "This is beautiful work," he said, his voice soft. Ilara's own voice was tight, a knot in her throat. "My husband made it," she said, the words costing her a great deal. "For our daughter." It was the first time she had mentioned them to him. The two words, husband, daughter, hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. Silas looked at her, and his eyes were not full of the pity she so hated, but of a deep, profound empathy that asked for no details, no explanations. He simply nodded, his expression full of a quiet understanding. He placed the small wooden bird back on the mantel, his touch as reverent as if he were in a church, in his silence, in his simple, wordless acknowledgement of her loss. She felt a moment of profound emotional intimacy, a connection that went deeper than any conversation they had ever had. As the days grew longer and the sun gained a little warmth, the first signs of the coming spring began to appear. The snow at the edge of the clearing began to melt, revealing patches of damp, dark earth. The relentless grip of winter was beginning to loosen. And with the thaw came the unavoidable reality of Silas's departure. His leg was nearly healed. He could walk without a limp now. The practical reason for him to stay was gone, vanished with the melting snow. The unspoken tension between them reached its peak. Neither of them wanted him to leave, but neither of them knew how to say it. Ilara's fear of being vulnerable, of opening her heart again only to have it broken, was at war with her growing, terrifying fear of being truly alone again. Silas's desperate desire for a peaceful life with this strong, quiet woman was at war with the certain knowledge that his past was a hungry wolf, and if it ever caught up to him here, it would destroy her too. The part ended with Silas standing at the open cabin door, looking out at the thawing landscape. A clear path was now visible, a path that led back to the world he had tried to leave behind, the world of guns and violence and running. Ilara sat at the table behind him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, watching him. The question of his leaving hung between them, as vast and silent and uncertain as the wilderness that stretched out before them. The Montana spring did not arrive gently. It came with a fierce, vibrant energy, a wild and sudden rush of life that seemed to fight the memory of winter. The vast drifts of snow did not so much melt as collapse, receding from the land to reveal the dark, damp earth beneath, breathing a scent of wet soil and new beginnings into the air. Water was everywhere, trickling and rushing in newly formed rivulets, the sound of a world unshackling itself from ice. And then, almost overnight, patches of brilliant green grass appeared, followed by the first hardy wildflowers, their colors a defiant shout against the lingering browns and grays. The sky seemed higher, bluer, and the air filled with the clamor of returning birdsong. This violent, beautiful awakening of the landscape was a mirror to the tentative, fragile blossoming of emotion between Ilara and Silas. The practical reason for his presence had vanished with the last of the snow. The path to the outside world was clear, yet he remained. They lived in an unspoken agreement, a delicate limbo where the future was a country neither of them dared to map. He never said, "I will stay," and she never said, "You must go," and so he stayed. Silas threw himself into the heavy work of the homestead, repaying the debt of her care with sweat and muscle. He moved with a purpose that was both powerful and quiet, a man grateful for the honest burn of labor. The section of split-rail fence that had collapsed under the weight of the winter snows he repaired, his axe and post-hole digger rising and falling with a steady, relentless rhythm. He cleared a new patch of land near the cabin for a garden, turning the rocky soil over spadeful by spadeful until it was dark and rich and ready for planting. He climbed onto the barn roof, nimble and sure-footed, and replaced the shingles that the blizzard's winds had torn away. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side in a way that felt as natural as breathing. A comfortable silence grew between them, the kind that does not need to be filled with chatter. It was a silence punctuated by the shared grunt of lifting a heavy log, the scrape of a hoe on stone, and brief, meaningful glances that said more than words ever could. Ilara found her eyes drawn to him as he worked. She watched the powerful grace in his movements, the play of muscles in his back and arms as he swung the axe. She watched the way the bright spring sun caught in his dark hair, and the way he would sometimes pause, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and look out over the valley with an expression of profound, weary peace. The sight stirred something deep inside her, a warmth in her belly, a feeling she had thought was long dead and buried with Daniel. Their conversations, once as sparse as winter trees, began to grow and deepen. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the small porch of the cabin. The sun was setting, a spectacular explosion of orange and pink that cast long, purple shadows across the valley. For a long time, they just watched it, the silence easy between them. Then Silas began to speak, his voice low. He began to open up about his past, though the story he told was veiled, the truth seen through a clouded glass. He spoke of a restlessness that had driven him his whole life, a feeling of never truly belonging anywhere he went. He did not mention the guns, the saloons, or the killing, but he spoke of the weight of his regrets, of faces he saw in his dreams that he could not forget. He spoke of a desperate, bone-deep yearning for a place to be still, a place where he did not have to look over his shoulder. "A man's past has a long shadow," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Sometimes it feels like it's stretching all the way from Texas to catch up with me." The mention of Texas, the quiet sorrow in his voice, his confession of a haunted spirit, was an invitation. In his vulnerability, he gave her the courage to face her own. Ilara took a deep, shaky breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. And then, for the first time, she unlocked the door to her own grief and let him inside. She told him about Daniel and Lily. She did not just state the cold, hard facts of their deaths. She brought them back to life with her words, painting them in vibrant color for him. She described Daniel's hands, how they were calloused and strong, but so gentle with wood that he could make it sing. He was a carpenter by trade and by heart, she explained, and he had built this cabin, this barn, this life, with those two hands. She spoke of Lily, of her infectious, bubbling giggle that used to fill the silence of the valley. She told him of her daughter's fascination with butterflies, how she would chase them for hours through the summer meadows, her hair the color of corn silk flying out behind her. She told him how Lily would sometimes leave a small bouquet of wildflowers on her pillow as a surprise in the morning. As she spoke, giving voice to the memories she had held locked inside her for 2 years, the tears she had held back finally fell. They were not the racking, hysterical sobs of fresh grief, but a silent, steady stream that traced paths down her dusty cheeks. She did not bother to wipe them away. Silas did not move. He did not reach for her, did not offer her empty, comforting platitudes like, "They're in a better place." He simply sat there, his presence beside her a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm of her sorrow. He listened, and in his listening, she felt the crushing burden of her grief lessen, just a little. It was no longer a weight she had to carry entirely on her own. He was helping her carry it now. The desire that had been simmering between them for months, a low heat beneath the surface of their quiet lives, grew into an undeniable force. The air around them became charged, a constant, humming presence. Every accidental touch was a spark, every shared glance a burning ember. It was a tension that could not hold forever. It had to break. It broke on a rainy afternoon in late spring. A sudden thunderstorm had rolled in from the mountains, the sky turning a dark, bruised purple. They were in the barn, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof a steady beat around them, the air thick with the sweet, earthy scent of hay and wet ground. A sudden, violent clap of thunder shook the very foundations of the barn. Ilara jumped, startled by the noise, and stumbled backward over a loose floorboard. Silas moved without thinking. his reflexes honed by a different, more dangerous life. He caught her before she could fall, his hands closing firmly on her upper arms to steady her. And just like that, they were close. His face was only inches from hers, so close she could see the flecks of gray in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. The world outside, the drumming rain and the rumbling thunder, faded away into a distant roar. The only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart, the sound of their shared, ragged breathing. In that moment, everything changed. Silas looked down into her eyes, and he did not see the cursed widow of redemption. He saw Ilara, a woman of incredible strength, a woman of heartbreaking sorrow, a beautiful, wounded woman who had saved his life. And Ilara looked up at him, and she no longer saw a dangerous stranger, an intruder in her solitude. She saw Silas, a man with his own scars, his own ghosts, a man who saw her, who truly saw her, not as a tragedy but as a person. He lowered his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, giving her every possible chance to pull away, to turn her head, to say no. She did not move. She stood perfectly still, her body trembling slightly in his grasp, and then his lips met hers. Their first kiss was not explosive or desperate. It was tender, questioning, a soft exploration in the storm-scented quiet of the barn. It was a kiss full of a deep, aching need, the need of two lonely souls who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched, to be held, to be wanted. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and of sorrow and of the faint, fragile promise of healing. For Ilara, it was a moment of profound surrender, a letting go of the frozen grief that had been her shield and her prison for 2 long years. For Silas, it was a moment of arrival, a feeling of coming home for the very first time in his life. That one gentle kiss opened the floodgates. It led them from the barn, through the pouring rain, and into the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. Their passion was not just a physical act. It was an expression of all the pent-up loneliness, all the grief, all the longing they had both carried for so long in their solitary worlds. It was a desperate, beautiful collision, a confirmation that they were alive, that they could still feel. 2 lonely souls finding solace and refuge in a fierce, unexpected joy in one another. Later, they lay in the quiet darkness of the cabin, the rain still tapping softly on the roof. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light on their bodies. Ilara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She reached up and gently traced the faint scar along his jaw with her fingertip. "Tell me your real story, Silas," she whispered into the darkness. And so he did, with her lying in his arms, in the safety and intimacy of the aftermath. He finally let go of the last of his secrets. He told her everything. He told her about his life as a gun for hire for a wealthy, ruthless cattle baron down in Texas. He told her about an ambush that had gone wrong, a blur of smoke and blood and shouting. He told her about killing a man named Abel, a young ranch hand who had not even been part of the fight, who had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he told her about the price on his head, put there by Abel's powerful, vengeful brothers who would not stop until he was dead. He explained that he had been running ever since, trying to disappear into the vastness of the country. He laid his ugly, violent past bare before her, a heavy, shameful weight. He fully expected to feel her pull away, to see disgust or fear dawn in her eyes. Instead, Ilara listened with a quiet, solemn intensity. When he was finished, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of his confession. She was quiet for a long time. Then, she shifted, propping herself up on an elbow to look down at him. She touched his face, her fingers gentle against his skin. "That was a different man," she said softly, her voice clear and sure in the darkness. "That's not the man who fixed my fence. That's not the man who listened while I cried." In that moment, with those simple words, she offered him absolution. She gave him a grace he had never expected, a grace he never thought he deserved. She did not see the killer he had been, She saw the good, quiet man he was desperately trying to become, and that acceptance, that unconditional seeing of him, solidified their bond. It transformed the fragile connection born of a snowstorm into a deep, resilient, and profound love. They were no longer just two survivors, hiding from the world. They were partners, bound by shared secrets and a fierce, mutual desire to build a new life from the wreckage of their pasts. Their happiness, however, was a fragile bubble in a harsh and unforgiving world. The story that the trapper Jed had carried back to redemption, the story of the widow and her mysterious guest, had taken root in the town's fertile soil of suspicion and had grown into a thorny weed of gossip. And preacher Theron used it to his full advantage. From his pulpit, he preached fire and brimstone sermons about the wickedness of the flesh, about the dangers of inviting sin and temptation into one's home. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, of the wolf that comes in sheep's clothing to prey upon the weak and the grieving. He never used Ilara's name, but every man, woman, and child in that church knew exactly who he was talking about. He skillfully painted her as a fallen woman, a harlot who had dishonored her husband's memory, and Silas as a devilish tempter, a man of unknown and likely wicked origins, who had come to prey upon her weakness. This escalating rhetoric soon had real-world consequences. They ran low on flour and coffee, and a trip to town became unavoidable. This time, Silas would not let her go alone. He walked beside her down the muddy main street of Redemption, and the hostility was no longer just in whispers and averted glances. It was open and aggressive. Men who had once nodded at her now glowered at Silas from the doorways of the saloon and the blacksmith's shop. Women pulled their children to the far side of the boardwalk as they approached. The confrontation they had both feared came outside Henderson's general store. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's devout follower, stood waiting for them as they came out, her face a mask of righteous fury. "Harlot!" she spat, her voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "You shame your dead husband, taking a strange man into your bed. You are an adulteress in the eyes of God Almighty." Ilara flinched as if struck. Before she could find her voice, Silas stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply looked at Mrs. Gable, and the cold, quiet deadliness he had tried so hard to leave behind in Texas flickered in his eyes. "You will not speak to her that way again," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Something in his tone, something in the absolute stillness of his posture, terrified the woman more than any shout could have. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, then turned and scurried away. The damage, however, was done. The town had drawn its battle lines, and they were standing on the wrong side. Back at the homestead, the ugly confrontation lingered in the air like a foul smell. Ilara was shaken, the old, familiar fear creeping back into her eyes. "They'll never leave us be," she whispered, her voice trembling. She looked up at him, her face full of a terrible sorrow. "Maybe you should go, Silas, before they—" She could not finish the sentence. He took her hands in his grip firm and steady. His gaze was unwavering. "I'm not running anymore, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "Not from my past, and not from them. This is my home now." He looked around at the small cabin, the barn, the valley spread out before them. Then his eyes returned to hers, and they were full of a fierce, protective love. "You are my home." He sealed his promise with a kiss that was no longer tentative or questioning, but full of a deep and certain conviction. They stood together on the small porch as the sun dipped below the mountains, a united front against the encroaching darkness. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, they were both keenly, terrifyingly aware that their love had just made them a target. The fragile peace they had built, as delicate and beautiful as a spring wildflower, was not meant to last. The love that had bloomed in the isolated quiet of the homestead was not a secret shared between two souls. It was a beacon, a defiant light in the darkness, and it drew the unwanted attention of the very darkness they had both tried to escape. The source of that darkness, the heart of the coming storm, was not in some distant Texas town, but just a few miles down the trail, in the sanctimonious heart of preacher Theron. From his pulpit in Redemption, Theron saw the world not through the lens of Scripture, but through the warped glass of his own greed. He was not a true zealot. His piety was a costume he wore, a tool he wielded with expert precision. Beneath the severe black coat and the thunderous pronouncements of God's will was a man consumed by a cold, calculating avarice and a sanctimonious sense of entitlement. His sermons were performances, his congregation a field to be managed and harvested. And for years, he had coveted Alara Vance's land. He saw past the small cabin and the struggling fences. He saw the creek that ran through the western edge of her property, a steady, reliable source of water that never ran dry. Even in the hottest summers, in this arid country, water was more than life. It was wealth. He had approached her husband, Daniel, years ago, with an offer to buy the land for the church, a pittance disguised as a godly transaction. Daniel, a proud and stubborn man who loved his home, had seen the greed in the preacher's eyes and had flatly, almost contemptuously, refused. The refusal had planted a seed of bitter resentment in Theron's soul, a seed that he watered patiently with envy and hate. The truth of that terrible night 2 years ago was a secret he kept locked away, a memory he would visit in the quiet of his study, turning it over and over like a strange, dark jewel. It had not been random vagrants. He remembered the sting of the wind-driven snow on his face as he and 2 hired men, thugs from a mining town 2 counties over, had ridden to the Vance homestead. The plan had been simple intimidation, to put the fear of God, or at least the fear of violent men, into Daniel Vance and force him to reconsider the offer. But Daniel had not been a man to frighten easily. He had come out of his cabin holding a lantern, his face hard and unafraid in the flickering light. The confrontation had escalated quickly, angry words turning to shoves. A fight had broken out in the swirling snow, and in a moment of pure, unrestrained rage, Theron himself, the man of God, had picked up a heavy iron tool from the woodpile and had brought it down on the back of Daniel's head. He remembered the sickening crunch of it, the way Daniel had simply folded, falling without a sound. And then, the small gasp from the porch. Little Lily, woken by the shouting, stood there in her nightgown, her small face a perfect circle of terror, her eyes wide. She had seen him. She had seen his face in the lantern light. In that instant, a cold, calculated panic had seized Theron. There could be no witnesses. The girl had to be silenced. It was a regretful necessity, a loose end to be tied. He had orchestrated the scene with cold precision, making it look like a robbery gone wrong, a piece of brutal, random violence. And then, for the next 2 years, he had patiently used his pulpit to build the myth of the cursed widow. He had woven a narrative of divine judgment and dark omens, ensuring that the townsfolk would fear and shun her, isolating her completely. His plan was a cruel, slow siege. Eventually, worn down by loneliness and misfortune, she would be forced to sell the unlucky land to the only buyer she had left, him, acting on behalf of the church, for a fraction of its true worth. Silas Cole's presence had upended everything. Theron saw the man's arrival not as a moral affront, but as a catastrophic disruption of his patient, carefully laid plan. A man was on the property now, a strong man, working the land, repairing the fences, protecting the widow. The siege was broken. Theron's sermons grew more pointed, more venomous. He no longer spoke in vague allusions. He spoke now of a serpent in the garden of our community, a wolf in sheep's clothing who had come to redemption to defile the righteous and lead the weak of faith astray. He stoked the town's latent fear and paranoia, turning the unknown stranger, Silas, into a folk devil, a scapegoat for every misfortune. The campaign of intimidation began subtly, with the cruel, symbolic language of the frontier. One morning, Alara found a dead raven on her doorstep, its black eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. a clear omen of ill will. A few nights later, they woke to find a section of the fence Silas had just repaired cut. The wires snipped clean through. These were warnings, whispers of violence meant to unsettle them, to remind them that they were being watched. The acts of vandalism terrified Alara. They were echoes of the violation she had already endured, a triggering of the deep trauma she was just beginning to heal from. She began to jump at every sound, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Silas recognized the tactics immediately. It was the way a predator circles its prey, testing its defenses, enjoying its fear. His own transformation was swift and total. The gentle farmer he had tried to become receded, and the old instincts, the hyper-vigilance of the hunted man, flared back to life. He rarely slept more than an hour at a time, often sitting up through the night in a chair by the door, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes watching the dark, impenetrable line of trees that surrounded them. The sweet, hopeful peace he had found with Alara was now tainted by the bitter taste of constant, simmering fear. Theron, watching from the town, realized that these petty intimidations were not working. The man, Cole, was not frightened off easily. He needed to be removed, permanently. The solution to his problem arrived in a letter from an associate in Cheyenne, a man with whom Theron occasionally conducted less than holy business. The letter was a response to an inquiry Theron had made, a simple request for information on any wanted men who might have passed through the territory. The associate's reply was a gift from the devil himself. It contained a detailed description and a name: Silas Cole, a gunslinger formerly in the employ of a Texas cattle baron, wanted for the killing of Abel Clanton, a substantial price on his head, offered by the dead man's vengeful brothers. Theron held the letter in his hands, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his thin lips. He saw his opportunity, a way to remove the obstacle and sanctify the act in the eyes of his flock. He went to the telegraph office himself. The message he sent was brief and to the point, addressed to the Clanton Ranch in West Texas. It contained only a location and a name. He was delivering the serpent directly into the hands of those who had every reason to crush its head. A few weeks later, they arrived. There were 3 of them, the surviving Clanton brothers. They were weathered, merciless men, their faces burned dark by the Texas sun, their eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. Their movements were economical and sure, the movements of men who lived and dealt in violence. They were not mindless thugs, they were seasoned hunters of men. They did not ride into redemption to announce their presence. Instead, they made a wide circle around the town and approached the Vance homestead from the hills, like wolves. For 2 days, they watched from a distance, studying the layout of the cabin and the barn, learning the rhythms of the man and woman who lived there. They were patient. They waited for the right moment. The attack came at dusk. The sky was bleeding purple and orange. Alara and Silas were inside the cabin, the lantern lit, sharing a quiet meal of rabbit stew. It was a moment of simple, domestic peace. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, frantic barking of the scruffy dog Alara had inherited with the homestead, a loyal and vigilant creature. The barking was cut short by a sickening yelp, a sound of pain that was abruptly silenced. Silas was on his feet in an instant, the half-eaten stew forgotten. In a single, fluid motion, he had his Colt in his hand. "Get down!" he yelled, his voice a harsh crack in the quiet. He shoved Alara towards the floor just as the first bullets ripped through the thin log walls of the cabin. Splinters of wood exploded into the room. The glass of the window shattered, spraying shards across the floor. The cabin, their sanctuary, instantly became a death trap. Silas moved with a deadly, efficient grace. The man he had tried to leave behind in Texas taking complete control. He was no longer a farmer, no longer a lover. He was a cornered animal, fighting with a skill and desperation that was terrifying to behold. "The root cellar!" he shouted, pushing Alara towards the trapdoor in the floor. "Hide!" But she shook her head, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "No!" She scrambled to the wall and grabbed her own Winchester rifle. She would not be a helpless victim again. She would not lose another family in this cabin. She would fight. The next minutes were a blur of chaos, noise, and visceral terror. Muzzle flashes lit up the growing darkness outside. Bullets thudded into the log walls, into the furniture, whining as they ricocheted. One of the Clanton brothers, a big bearded man, made the mistake of trying to storm the front door. Silas fired twice. The man staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing on the porch. But in the exchange of fire, Silas cried out, a sharp intake of breath. A bullet had grazed his side, a searing, hot line of pain that made him stumble. He and Alara were pinned down behind the heavy overturned table. And then a new, more terrifying threat appeared. A flickering orange light danced outside the shattered window. They were trying to set the cabin on fire. A flaming torch landed on the dry shingles of the roof with a soft whoosh. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to seep through the ceiling. In that moment of hellish horror, pinned down, wounded, their home burning around them, Silas turned to Alara. His face was grim, streaked with soot, his teeth clenched against the pain in his side. He was afraid, not for himself, but for her. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice thick with a terrible regret. "I brought this to you. All of this." Alara, her own face smudged with soot, her knuckles white where she gripped her rifle, reached out and grabbed his face with her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were fierce, burning with a love that was stronger than the terror that surrounded them. "No," she said, her voice shaking but full of an unyielding conviction. "You brought me back to life, Silas. Do not you dare be sorry. We fight this together." They knew they could not stay. The smoke was getting thicker, choking them. They had to make a break for the barn, using the growing darkness and the thick pall of smoke as cover. They burst out the back door. The second Clanton brother was waiting for them, a dark shape against the flickering light of the fire. Alara saw him first. She screamed Silas's name, a raw, primal sound, and fired the rifle. Her shot went wide, but it served its purpose. It made the man flinch, a split second of hesitation. It was all the time Silas needed. He fired, and the second brother fell. But Silas was stumbling, his side on fire, his vision blurring from the pain and smoke, and the third and final brother, the eldest and most cunning of the three, used that moment of weakness. He emerged from the shadows of the barn and got the drop on Silas, pressing the cold, round muzzle of a pistol against his temple. The scene froze, the crackling of the fire, the vast, silent indifference of the night sky. The man looked past Silas at Alara, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting his lips. "Now you get to watch him die," he sneered, his voice a low growl. "Just like my brother did." Alara stood frozen 10 paces away, the now empty rifle hanging uselessly in her hands. A terrible, soul-crushing despair washed over her. It was happening again. Everyone she loved was destined to be taken from her in this very spot. Silas closed his eyes, preparing for the end, and in that moment of ultimate despair, a single, sharp rifle crack echoed from the darkness at the edge of the woods. It was a different sound from their own guns, heavier, deeper. The third Clanton brother crumpled to the ground, a dark hole appearing in his back, his cruel smile wiped away forever. Standing in the deep shadows of the pine trees, a smoking rifle in his hands, was Jed, the old trapper. He had been checking his lines on the ridge nearby, had seen the orange glow of the fire against the night sky, and had heard the gunshots. He had made his way down cautiously, and he had understood in an instant what he was seeing. He had heard the preacher's venomous talk in town, and he knew it had finally led to this. He had chosen a side. The part ended in the immediate, shocking silence that followed the violence. The homestead, the sanctuary they had built together, was a roaring inferno, sending sparks and smoke into the uncaring night sky. 3 men lay dead in the yard. Silas, bleeding and weak, was leaning heavily on Alara, his weight almost more than she could bear. Jed stood grimly at the edge of the clearing, his rifle still smoking. The physical threat of the Clantons was over, but the emotional and physical devastation was immense. Their home was a ruin. Their peace was shattered. They had survived, but the fire from their burning home cast a hellish, dancing glow on their faces, illuminating the terrible cost of their love and Silas's past. They were left standing in the ruins of their life, their future more uncertain than it had ever been. In the aftermath of the final shot, a silence descended that was more profound and deafening than the violence that had preceded it. The main cabin was no longer a home but a roaring pyre, a jagged skeleton of burning logs against the cold night sky, sending thick plumes of acrid smoke upwards to mingle with the indifferent stars. The only light came from the destructive, dying flames and the single, steady glow of a lantern Jed had lit. Ilara, Silas, and Jed stood in the yard amidst the carnage. The world shrunk to a hellish tableau. The bodies of the Clanton brothers were dark, still shapes on the ground, their violent purpose ended. The shock held them for only a moment, then adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through Ilara's haze of horror. The first priority, the only priority, was Silas. He was slumping against her, his breathing shallow and ragged, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt, running on a will of pure iron. She tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her petticoat, her hands trembling but her movements swift and sure. The bullet had gone deep into his side, and it was bleeding profusely. Between her and Jed, they managed to half carry, half drag him away from the burning ruin and into the relative safety of the barn. The door creaked shut behind them, muffling the roar of the fire. The familiar smells of hay, animals, and dry earth filled their lungs. A bizarrely comforting and domestic scent in a world that had just been torn apart by smoke and death. Jed, the grizzled trapper, proved to be an ally as solid and unyielding as the mountains he roamed. He wasted no time on pity or questions. His face was a grim mask in the lantern light as he helped Ilara. While she held the lantern steady, he took his skinning knife, heated the blade in the flame until it glowed, and carefully probed the wound. His hands surprisingly steady. He managed to extract the flattened piece of lead, a procedure that made Silas cry out in a raw animal sound of pain before passing out completely. They cleaned the wound as best they could with the last of the whiskey from Silas's saddle flask and packed it with clean rags before binding it tightly with more strips of Ilara's petticoat. Once Silas was settled on a deep pile of hay, his breathing shallow but steady for the moment, Jed turned to the other grim necessity. He went back out into the yard. Ilara watched from the barn door as he methodically dragged the three bodies to the far edge of the clearing, near the tree line, and covered them with a canvas tarp from his own pack. His actions were those of a man long accustomed to the harsh and unsentimental realities of frontier life. Death was a chore to be dealt with, like skinning a buck. When he was done, he came back and stood beside her, looking at the smoldering remains of her home. "Heard the preachers talk in town last time I was through," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. He did not look at her. Knew it was leadin' to no good, all that talk of sin and serpents. He paused, then spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "That man ain't speaking for God," he said with finality. "He's speaking for himself." The next few days were a descent into a living hell. As Jed had warned, the wound became infected. Silas developed a raging fever that turned his skin to fire and his mind to a churning swamp of nightmares. He tossed and turned in the makeshift bed of hay, his strong body racked with shudders, his hands clenching and unclenching on the rough blanket. His mind was trapped in a nightmarish loop, reliving the gunfight, the flash of muzzles in the dark, and the ghosts of 100 other violent encounters from his past. Ilara refused to leave his side. She was a wraith, hollowed out by exhaustion, grieving for her destroyed home, and suspended in a constant state of terror that she was going to lose him. But she channeled all her fear, all her sorrow, into the singular, desperate focus of keeping him alive. The scenes of her nursing him were raw and visceral. She was in a constant battle against the fever, sponging his burning skin with cool water from the stock tank. She laboriously rendered the last of their salted pork into a thin, greasy broth and forced it, spoonful by spoonful, between his cracked, dry lips. And she talked to him, constantly. Her voice was a low, desperate plea, a constant murmur in the quiet of the barn. "Hold on, Silas. You have to hold on. Come back to me, please. Come back." In his delirium, all the walls Silas had built around his past crumbled. His defenses were gone, and the dark things he kept locked away came pouring out in a fevered torrent of mumbled words. He murmured names of dusty towns and long-forgotten saloons. He called out for Abel, the man he had killed, his voice sometimes thick with the anger of the fight, other times breaking with a guilt-ridden apology. He spoke of his own father, a brutal man, it seemed, who had taught him with his fists that violence was the only language the world truly understood. Ilara listened to these fragmented, fevered confessions, and she did not feel the fear or revulsion she might have once expected. Instead, she felt a profound, heart-wrenching empathy that tightened her chest. She saw past the hardened gunslinger, past the killer and the runner, and she saw the wounded boy inside. The boy who had been taught that love was weakness and survival was all that mattered. Her love for him, already so deep, shifted and deepened further, becoming fiercely, ferociously protective. She was no longer just his lover. She was the guardian of his broken soul, the keeper of the secrets that poured from him in the fever heat. While she was locked in this desperate, intimate battle for his life, the outside world began to close in. The fire had been a beacon in the night sky, visible for miles. 2 days after the gunfight, a pair of riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was the sheriff from Redemption, a weak-willed man named Cobb with a drooping mustache and shifty eyes, a man who was firmly and wholly in Preacher Theron's pocket. He was accompanied by 2 deputies whose faces were set in grim, self-important lines. Sheriff Cobb dismounted and took in the scene with a slow, deliberate gaze. The blackened, skeletal ruin of the cabin, the dark, ominous stains on the ground, and the grim-faced woman who stood in the doorway of the barn, a rifle held loosely in her hands. His interrogation of Ilara was a masterclass in veiled accusation. He did not ask her what had happened. He told her what he and the town already assumed had happened. His questions were traps, designed to lead to one conclusion. "So this stranger you've been harboring," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "This Silas Cole, appears he brought his trouble right to your doorstep, didn't he, Mrs. Vance?" He gestured to the ruin of her home. "Seems there was a falling out, amongst thieves, perhaps?" Ilara, bone-weary and stretched to the breaking point, refused to be led. Her answers were clipped, stark, and defiant. "We were attacked in our home," she said, her voice low and steady. "We defended ourselves." "Defended yourselves against 3 men?" Cobb scoffed. "Quite a story." He demanded to see Silas. He pushed past her into the dim, hay-scented interior of the barn. He found Silas lying in the hay, barely conscious, his face flushed with fever, muttering incomprehensibly. The sheriff's eyes fell on Silas's gun belt, which Ilara had hung on a nearby post. He grunted, a sound of satisfaction. It was all the proof he needed. He turned back to Ilara, his face set in a mask of official authority. "That man is a known fugitive. There's a price on his head." He hooked his thumbs in his own belt. "As soon as he is fit to travel, I am placing him under arrest and taking him to Redemption to stand trial for the murder of those 3 men out there." The words hit Ilara like a physical blow. The law, as interpreted by Preacher Theron's puppet, was not on their side. Justice in a town that had already condemned them was a foregone conclusion. They would hang him. This was her lowest point. Her home was gone, burned to the ground. The man she loved, the man who had brought her back to life, was near death. And if, by some miracle, he survived, he would be handed over to a corrupt and prejudiced system that would surely see him hanged. The town's ugly whispers had won. The curse they all believed she carried felt crushingly real. It seemed that every person she dared to love was destined to be violently taken from her. She felt herself begin to break. In a moment of quiet, abject despair later that day. After the sheriff had gone, she sat on an overturned bucket outside the barn, staring at the blackened ruins of her life. A cold, familiar numbness began to creep into her limbs. The same icy feeling that had enveloped her for 2 years. It felt easier to not feel, to let the frost creep back in, to freeze her heart once more before it could be shattered again. But then, just as the numbness threatened to consume her, a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of Jed, trudging back up the trail to the homestead. He brought not only a sack of food and a precious bottle of carbolic acid he had borrowed from the doctor's office in town, but he also brought information. He told her that the story spreading like wildfire through Redemption was the one Sheriff Cobb and Preacher Theron wanted told, that Silas, the murderous gunslinger, had tried to kill Ilara and burn the evidence of his other crimes, but had been wounded in the process by the brave Clanton brothers who had tracked him down. Theron was using the tragedy to cement his narrative, to paint himself as the town's protector, and to finally drive the cursed widow off her land so he could claim it for the church. But, Jed said, leaning closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, a few folks ain't buying it, not all of it. He said that people who had known Ilara her whole life, people who remembered the kind, happy girl she had been before the tragedy, were starting to have their doubts. They were starting to question the sheer volume of the preacher's venom. The seed of doubt had been planted in the hard soil of Redemption. That small piece of news, that tiny crack in the town's solid wall of judgment, combined with something else. Later that night, as she was changing the bandage on his side, Silas, lost in his delirium, reached out and his hand found hers. He mumbled her name, the sound thick and slurred, but clear. Ilara. It was a prayer. Something inside her broke, not in despair but in a surge of pure, defiant rage. The numbness receded, washed away by a hot, cleansing fire. They would not take him. She would not lose him. Her grief and her fear were forged in that moment into a new, unshakable resolve. She was no longer just a survivor, buffeted by the whims of fate and cruel men. She was a fighter. 2 days later, the fever broke. Silas woke up, the world slowly swimming back into focus. He was weak, battered, and his side was a landscape of agony, but his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He saw Ilara watching him, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, brilliant light he had never seen before. She told him everything. She told him about the sheriff's visit, about the murder charges, about the lies Theron was spreading through the town. She laid the hopelessness of their situation bare before him, expecting to see despair, the old urge to run, dawn in his eyes. Instead, she saw the same fierce resolve reflected back at her. The fire had burned away more than just their home. It had burned away the last of his desire to run. He had found his home, and he would not be run off from it. The part ended there, in a quiet, powerful scene in the dim light of the barn. Silas was propped up against a pile of hay bales, Ilara sitting on the ground beside him, her hand resting on his. They both knew the truth. The law was against them. The town was a powder keg waiting for a spark. A conventional fight for justice was impossible. "They'll hang you, Silas," Ilara said, her voice a stark, raw whisper. He looked at her, his gaze clear and steady. "Not if they can't find me," he replied. But his tone was not that of a man planning to flee into the mountains. It was the tone of a man planning a different kind of fight, a different kind of disappearance. They looked at each other, and a silent, complete understanding passed between them. They could not win by playing by the town's rules. They would have to change the game. They would have to find their own form of justice, a raw frontier justice aimed not at the dead Clantons, but at the true monster responsible for all their pain, Preacher Theron. Their fight for survival had just become a fight for retribution. The cloying, heavy despair of the aftermath did not linger. In its place, a tense, focused calm settled over the barn and the blackened clearing. The smoke had cleared, and so had the confusion. Ilara and Silas, with the grim and steady presence of Jed, were no longer just surviving. They were planning. The sheriff's threat was not an idle one. Waiting for him to return with a warrant and a posse meant a guaranteed noose for Silas. Their only option, their only path to any kind of future, was to tear down Preacher Theron's wall of lies before he could cement it forever. Their plan was risky, a desperate gamble against a stacked deck. It hinged on a dangerous idea, turning the town's own prejudice, its own fervent piety, against the very man who had cultivated it. Silas was still weak, the wound in his side a constant burning reminder of how close they had come to ruin. But his strength returned with each passing day, his recovery fueled not by medicine, but by a cold, quiet fury. He and Ilara spent hours in the dim light of the barn, talking, piecing together the fractured puzzle of the past. With Silas listening intently, his presence giving her strength. Ilara recounted the night of her family's murder. She dredged up details she had long suppressed, memories that were too painful or too confusing to examine before. She remembered an unfamiliar scent that had hung in the air that night, the smell of cheap, foul cigar smoke, a smell she had never associated with Daniel or any of their few visitors. She recalled finding a muddy footprint near the barn the next morning, half obscured by the new snow, a print made by a large, heavy boot that was not her husband's. Silas, drawing on a lifetime of experience with duplicitous and violent men, listened to these small details and began to see a dark pattern emerge. He connected them to what he already knew of Theron, the initial, aggressive offer to buy the land, the timing of the supposed attack by vagrants, under the cover of a winter storm, a perfect time for murder to go unseen, and, most damningly, the preacher's immediate and sustained campaign to isolate Ilara, to paint her as cursed and her land as tainted. It was never about God's mysterious will. It was a calculated, cold-blooded land grab. The motive was as clear as a mountain stream, but they had no tangible proof to show the world. All they had were whispers, shadows, and the word of a fallen woman and a wanted man. Jed became their eyes and ears in redemption. He would slip into town before dawn and return after dusk, a ghost moving through the landscape. He brought back news that was both terrifying and galvanizing. Preacher Theron, in a grand gesture of spiritual theater, was planning a special service of cleansing to be held at the site of the burned-out homestead. He intended to lead his entire flock to the tainted ground to publicly pray over the ashes and to solemnly declare the land consecrated for the building of a new church annex. It was to be his final public act of conquest, a victory lap disguised as a holy rite. He was whipping the town into a frenzy of religious fervor, casting himself as the heroic shepherd purging the community of a great evil. Jed also brought a crucial piece of information, a name. The two deputies who were always with Sheriff Cobb, the two men who had stood behind him in the barn, were Theron's most loyal and thuggish parishioners, the Gable brothers. A cold certainty clicked into place for Ilara. She remembered seeing them flanking the preacher on many occasions, their expressions a mixture of brute loyalty and dull-eyed piety. They were the ones. They had to be the men who were with him that night. The plan they formulated in the hay-scented quiet of the barn was audacious. They could not ride into town with guns blazing. That would only prove Theron's narrative right, casting them as the violent devils he claimed they were. They had to confront him not with bullets, but with the one weapon he could not defend against, the truth. And they had to do it in front of the very people he had so skillfully manipulated. The cleansing service was not just his stage, it would have to become their own. The days leading up to the service were fraught with a terrible humming tension. Silas, against Ilara's worried protests, pushed his body to its limits. He stood in the clearing, his face pale with pain and effort, and practiced drawing his pistol until his hands were once again steady and sure. He was not preparing to kill, but he was preparing to be ready for anything. Ilara, meanwhile, undertook a deeply emotional and difficult task of her own. With a shovel and a heavy heart, she began to sift through the charred, sodden rubble of her home. It was a painful archaeology of her former life, unearthing the ghosts of broken pottery, melted glass, the twisted metal frame of her bed. And then, in the corner where Daniel's small desk had once stood. Her shovel struck something hard. She dug with her bare hands, pulling it from the ashes. It was the small metal box where Daniel had kept his important papers. It was scorched, dented, and half melted, but the clasp held. With trembling fingers, she pried it open. Inside, miraculously protected from the worst of the fire and water, was a bundle of oilskin-wrapped papers. There was the deed to the land, in Daniel's name, and beneath it, a letter, its ink slightly faded but perfectly legible. It was from a territorial land agent, and it detailed, in cold, businesslike terms, Preacher Theron's aggressive and repeated cash offers for the Vance property, and tucked inside that letter was Daniel's own written reply. A single, angry paragraph refusing the offer and telling the preacher in no uncertain terms to never ask again. It was not a confession to murder, but it was proof of motive. It was a solid, undeniable crack in Theron's saintly facade. The day of the service arrived under a cold, unforgiving gray sky that threatened rain but never delivered, holding the world in a state of gloomy suspense. A long procession of wagons and riders made its way from Redemption, a dark snake winding its way up the trail to the Vance homestead. Preacher Theron led them, riding a fine black horse, his face a mask of solemn, public piety. Most of the town was there, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, righteous fervor, and, in a few, a flicker of uneasy doubt. Theron dismounted and strode to the center of the blackened foundation, the dead heart of where the cabin had once stood. He raised his hands, and his voice, rich and booming, rolled across the silent clearing. He began his sermon, a masterpiece of theatrical pathos. He spoke of the devil that had walked among them, of the poor, misguided widow who had given him shelter, and of the sacred duty they now had to reclaim this wounded land for God. As he reached the crescendo of his speech, his voice ringing with false emotion, Alara stepped out of the shadows of the barn. She was not the timid, haunted widow they all remembered. She was dressed in a simple, dark dress, her face scrubbed clean, her hair pulled back neatly. Her posture was erect, her shoulders back. In her grief and her defiance, she looked almost regal. A murmur of shock and confusion ran through the crowd. Theron faltered, his words catching in his throat, his eyes wide with disbelief to see her there. Before he could react, Silas and Jed emerged from the other side of the barn. They held their rifles loosely, the barrels pointed at the ground. They did not aim at anyone, but their presence was a clear, unambiguous statement. The crowd gasped. "This is not God's land, preacher." Alara's voice rang out. It was not a shout, but it was clear and strong, and it cut through the preacher's sermon and silenced the crowd. "This is my land, the land you tried to steal from my husband." She took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. "The land you murdered him for." She held up the singed letter from the land agent. In a steady voice, she read Daniel's angry, defiant words. She told them about the muddy footprint that was not his, about the scent of cheap cigar smoke. She did not scream or cry. She laid out the facts with a cold, devastating logic that was more powerful than any emotional appeal. Then she raised her arm and pointed a trembling but steady finger at the two deputies standing beside the sheriff. "Ask them," she demanded, her voice rising. "Ask the Gable brothers where they were on the night of the storm 2 years ago." The brothers shifted uncomfortably, their brutish faces paling. Their eyes darted nervously to the preacher, looking for a sign, for a command. Theron recovered quickly, his shock morphing into a mask of righteous fury. He raised his own arm, pointing a condemning finger back at Alara. "Lies! She is a liar, a hysterical woman corrupted by the killer she keeps in her bed. She is a vessel of sin," he roared to the crowd. "Sheriff, seize the murderer!" Sheriff Cobb, flustered but obedient, drew his weapon, as did the Gables. But the crowd was no longer a single, unified entity. The seed of doubt Jed had spoken of had just been watered by Alara's words, by the hard evidence of the letter. People were looking at the preacher's contorted, furious face, then at Alara's steady, unwavering gaze, and they were beginning to see the truth. The storekeeper, Henderson, a man who had always been so cool to her, now looked deeply, profoundly uneasy. The tense standoff was broken not by a bullet, but by a single, trembling voice. Mrs. Gable, the devout woman who had publicly called Alara a harlot, the mother of the two deputies, took a hesitant step forward from the crowd. Her face was a canvas of pure terror. She looked at her two sons, their guns drawn, then at the preacher who held their souls in his hands. "My boys," she said, her voice a reedy, trembling thing, but audible in the deathly silence. "They came home that night, the night of the storm." Her eyes were wide with a dawning horror, as if she were finally understanding a truth she had long refused to see. "Their clothes were torn, and there was mud and blood on their boots. They told me. They said they hit a deer with the wagon." Her lie, the lie she had told herself and clung to for 2 long years, collapsed under the weight of the moment, shattering in the tense, silent air. That was the final crack. The preacher's authority, built on a foundation of lies and fear, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The crowd turned on him, their religious fervor instantly redirecting itself into a mob's raw fury at being so profoundly deceived. Theron, seeing his power, his very world, evaporate before his eyes, panicked. He fumbled inside his coat, grabbing for a small pistol he kept hidden there. He was not fast enough. A single, deliberate shot from Silas's pistol cracked through the air. The bullet did not hit Theron. It hit the gun in his hand, ripping it from his grasp and sending it flying into the dirt. It was not a killing shot. It was a disarming, a final, emphatic stripping of his power. In the ensuing chaos, the Gable brothers, abandoned by their leader and incriminated by their own mother, tried to bolt, Jed and a few of the newly emboldened townsmen. Henderson among them, surged forward and stopped them, wrestling them to the ground. Sheriff Cobb, a coward to the last, seeing which way the wind was now blowing, simply threw down his badge in the mud and surrendered. The confrontation was over. Justice, raw and swift, had been served, not by a court of law, but by the simple, undeniable power of the truth. The final scene took place a few weeks later. Spring had fully and truly arrived, bathing the valley in green and gold. The charred remains of the old cabin had been cleared away. In its place, Silas and Alara, with the help of Jed and a few quiet, repentant men from the town, were laying the foundations for a new, slightly larger cabin. The mood was not one of jubilant victory, but of a quiet, hopeful peace. Preacher Theron and the Gable brothers were locked in the Redemption jail, awaiting the arrival of a territorial judge who, by all accounts, would see them hang. The town of Redemption was beginning its own slow, painful process of healing from the poison of deceit that had festered in its heart for so long. Silas and Alara worked side by side, their movements in a comfortable, practiced sync. He lifted a heavy, freshly hewn log, his muscles straining. She guided it into place, her hands sure and steady. For a moment, their hands met on the rough wood. They looked at each other, and in their shared gaze was everything they had endured, and everything they had become. The scars were still there, his a puckered line of flesh on his side, hers etched invisibly on her soul, but they were no longer signs of weakness. They were symbols of their survival. The story ends with them standing together on the new foundation, the frame of their future home. They looked out at the vast, beautiful, and still wild land. It was a land that had witnessed their deepest tragedies, but it was also the land that would now witness their new beginning. "You were right," Silas said softly, his arm coming to rest around her shoulders. "I shouldn't have come here." Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, and a small, genuine smile, the first she had truly felt in years, graced her lips. "I'm glad you did," she replied. They had not erased the darkness of their pasts, but they had learned, finally, how to stand in the light together, their love a testament to the fact that even in the most frozen of hearts, and in the harshest of landscapes, hope can take root and grow. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.